Boker Tov Givrin.
Boker Tov.
Ma Shlomchem. Oh, I heard a Tov Meod for a change. Now that must have been someone who rightly guessed what words would be on the quiz. Okay. Now you'll note on that quiz that I used terms, I used words that occurred frequently in the text and were fairly common even outside the text, and that's the way all future vocabulary quizzes will be as well. I will focus on those terms that I want you to be certain that you obtain and understand. Let's first turn to Psalm 103, verse 8. Last week we were looking at verse 7, and verse 7 was he made known his ways to Moses, to the Israelites his deeds. And we saw how there was a chiastic arrangement. We saw how that yodia, the verb, was gapped. We talked about it being an initial wow verb, even though it begins with a yod in the lexicon. Yada, he knew that yod was originally a wow, and therefore it's called a pay wow or initial or one wow verb. We looked at that and discussed it somewhat as we looked at the pay wow and initial wow verbs. Today we're looking at verse 8. Verse 8 consists of two noun clauses. Noun clauses are where you have Hebrew words and a sentence without a verb. Rachum is an adjective. Rachum means merciful, compassionate. Wechanun, chanun is another adjective, means gracious. It's from the root chanan, as the first word is from the root rachem. And so these two are adjectives. As adjectives and without articles and being placed in the first position in the sentence, we know that they are predicate adjectives. As predicate adjectives, they predicate, they say something about the subject of the sentence. The subject of the sentence comes last, Yahweh. So Yahweh is. In other words, this is what is predicated about him. These two adjectives describe him, but you change it. You don't say gracious Yahweh or merciful Yahweh or compassionate Yahweh. That would be an attributive adjective relationship. A predicate adjective relationship puts the adjective in a predicate following the word is in English. So we put the subject first in English, contrary to the Hebrew order. Yahweh is compassionate and gracious. Okay, we supply the verb to be. Do not put it in italics when you do translation of noun clauses, because Hebrew grammar assumes that the verb is there, and you cannot translate it accurately unless you put it there, because it is a predicate situation, not an attributive situation. So you must put a form of the verb to be. Context determines whether you say Yahweh was compassionate and gracious, or whether you say Yahweh is compassionate and gracious, or whether you say Yahweh will be compassionate and gracious. Context and context alone determines that. In this psalm, we're talking about the various characteristic actions and behaviors and attributes of Yahweh. Therefore, in this context, in this hymn of praise, it is in the present tense. So it's Yahweh is compassionate and gracious. John?
Do we know it's not gracious Yahweh because the adjective doesn't have an article?
Absolutely. Yes, that's it. Because remember, Yahweh is a definite noun because it's a proper name. As a proper name, any adjective defining it attributively must agree with it in definiteness, gender, and number. Since Yahweh is definite, even though it doesn't have the article, then the adjective defining it must have the article. So without the article, this shows this is a predicate adjective and not attributive. Okay, other questions? Everyone understand that? Yes. Jan?
Not always though, right?
Pardon?
Not always though. The article is significant. Because sometimes it's with an article and still it's a predicate.
No, that would not be true. Adjectives, if they have the article, will not be predicate adjectives. Okay? You might be thinking of a participle. that might be used as a substantive and have an article on it and be used in a predicate position. Yahweh is the shepherd, for example. That would be a noun, not an adjective, and it would have the article. All right? Yes, Eric?
Do attributive adjectives ever precede nouns?
Do attributive adjectives ever precede nouns? I can't think of any instance. They normally would follow. Modifiers normally follow. Some modifiers will be put first for emphasis, but I can't think offhand of an attributive adjective that is put first. I think they always follow.
So then when we see this, we would kind of know pretty quickly since they're
When you see an adjective preceding, number one, that's your first question. This might be predicate because it's preceding. Number two, it seems to be confirmed by the fact that it does not have the article. And number three, the only noun in this first half of the verse is a definite noun, so that ultimately proves that it is a predicate. These are two predicate adjectives. Okay? Now, because this is normal word order, this does not mean that compassionate and gracious is being emphasized, because this is normal word order. Normal word order for predicate adjective clauses. All right, next we have the second line, Eric apayim. Eric means long or stretched out, extended. It is here used in the construct, and it's literally long of faces or long of noses, apayim. And the idea here is the concept that an individual who is described as such is patient, is enduring, is slow to anger, all right, is the concept. And af, besides meaning nose, can also mean anger. And apayim looks like a dual, it'd be like two angers. And all it's being used as here is an intensive type of plural that demonstrates that this is anger in an abstract fashion. And so it's here you would translate this either patient, or you would translate it as slow to anger. Literally long of angers or long of noses, if you want to be super literal. Why is nose used in the Hebrew idiom of anger? Some think it is because that when a person is angry, just like when a horse is angry or a bull is angry, the nostrils flare. And therefore that observation has made its way into the language. There's no way that we can know that for certain. That's just a somewhat educated guess. Maybe the Hebrews themselves didn't even realize or know where it came from or who first invented this phraseology or this idiom, or it may have been borrowed from another culture or another language. But that's just an educated guess. So long of anger and rav and great, or the idea here is abundant. In Hebrew, rav always refers to quantity. In Aramaic, rav refers to quality. Quality as chief, as great in quality. Rav in Hebrew is great in quantity. And so if you talk about great in loving kindness, chesed, here is the word, and it's best to translate as steadfast love, and Jeff caught that right away. Steadfast love or loyal love. It is abundant in steadfast love, abundant in loyal love. It is not the concept of quality, it's the concept of quantity. These two adjectives, just like the first two adjectives, have no article. In addition, these two adjectives parallel the preceding two. Yahweh is still the understood subject, and it is gapped. Here the subject is gapped rather than the verb. The subject is elided in the second line. Notice that that was necessary to maintain balance, because rachum has fewer syllables than Eric apayim. Eric apayim has 5 syllables. Rachum has 2. Wechanun has 2. where Rav Chesed has 3. So we have 5 syllables in the second, or 5, 6, 7, 8 syllables in the second line. And we have 2, 4, 5, 6 in the first line. Because remember, Yahweh is, it has its own vowels. And the vowels that are printed here do not belong to Yahweh. They belong to Adonai. Okay? So to keep balance, if we put Yahweh in the second line and make it even longer yet than the first line, longer than it is already. So balance dictates that part of the first line be gapped and understood in the second line. Okay? Any questions? Yes, James?
Can you repeat the full translation?
Yes. Yahweh is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abundant in loving kindness, or abundant in steadfast love. Steadfast love is what I prefer, or loyal love. But you'll often see chesed translated as loving kindness. The problem with loving kindness is that this word does not really refer to kindness. It refers more to the concept of loyalty than anything. As we mentioned before, I think Hasidic Jews are those who are committed, loyal to God. This is where they get their name from, this word. Okay, why is there a comments under the cheth in chased instead of a segol, chesed? In pause. In pause. The saluk there is on it. It's the last accented syllable of the verse, so it's heightened to a comments. Okay, question, Kyle?
Did you say chased? Is it that the steadfast love, that's the idea of quantity? It's
No,
like,
Rav is the quantity.
okay, Rav's the
Rav
quantity.
is quantity. Okay. All right? If you remember that about Rav, you'll be a step ahead when you come into the third semester Hebrew, because that's one of the major questions in third semester Hebrew that even makes its way on the final exam. Because if you don't know it by then, you're in trouble. Okay? Any other questions? If you are to preach or to give a devotional thought on this verse, how does the grammar aid you in stating your devotional thought or preaching it? What is exegetically significant about the grammar of this verse? Anyone?
The attributes of God.
All right. We're talking about attributes of God. We have 4 adjectives used in a predicate adjective position. They are attributes predicated of God, belonging to God. What else? John?
Well, it's kind of a question. Would you deal with them rather than a list of 4 as it's in 2 lists of 2? Because they're 2 separate statements. The Lord is gracious and compassionate. You kind of look at those, that thought as your first point.
I would group them into 2. I would see the first 2 as related. Compassionate and gracious are related. And the idea of slow to anger and abundant in steadfast love are also related. So I deal with them in 2 groups. Okay? All right. What is the other grammatical observation we can make that is exegetically significant about this verse? Go back to where I started and what I was talking about. What's the identification of the first line grammatically? It is a noun clause. What do we know about noun clauses in Hebrew? There is no verb. So what verb do we supply? A form of the verb be. All right? So this is describing what God was, is, or will be. The context makes us choose which of those 3. Is. Therefore, it's talking about that which characterizes God now, as well as yesterday and tomorrow. It is making a description, a descriptive phrase describing the characteristics of God. and they are present characteristics. And they're present in the sense that they are characteristically identified with him. That these are true in the past, in the present, and the future. And the context is what brings that out, because in the context, remember, we had a series of participles, for example, describing the current characteristic activities of God. And that carries on here with this verse as well. So that's where we come to this. You have that dual emphasis there because of the predicate adjectives being predicated of God. We're talking about his attributes, but we're talking about attributes that are characteristic throughout time of God, whether it's past, present, or future. It's not just talking about what he is today, but he won't be tomorrow or he wasn't yesterday. This is talking about what he always is by context and grammar. And that is something that is preachable, and it is a devotional concept that we need to remember, that regardless of what circumstances might seem to indicate, God never ceases to be compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abundant in steadfast love. That's the lesson that the psalmist in Psalm 89, Ethan the Ezrahite, had to learn in his own circumstances when he thought that by circumstances God had ceased to fulfill the promises that he had given to David through the prophet Nathan. And the message of the psalm is, regardless of what you are experiencing or what you see or what might appear, God does not lie. God is always faithful, even when we are unfaithful. No matter what the circumstances, God remains compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, and abundant in steadfast love. Kyle?
Just thinking of, in OT studies too, we're reading through the prophets, and obviously God's judgment and wrath is taking place, and there's a sense in which he said, I've had enough.
Right.
And he still includes the restoration. Is that kind of the idea? Like, even though I guess his anger is being manifested now. It's like, here it is, but at the same time, he's still going to have compassion. Is that the idea there?
Absolutely.
Is that how the character
Absolutely.
is retained, so to speak?
Yes. No matter, even if God is judging, he is still a compassionate God. He's showing us compassion even through his judgment and by his judgment. He is also at the same time, when he's judging others, he's being compassionate to those who are innocent in the midst of the situation. He always is this. This is not something that ceases to be characteristic of him even when he is angry or judging. It's still simultaneously characteristic of him, and he still shows himself with these characteristics. Okay? All right. Let's go from there now, and let's go back to talking about weak verbs. We are on page 161 of your textbook. We're going to today cover the last of these. I want to finish up what we began the other day on the pay noun or first noun verbs. Those verbs that begin with noun, the noun will tend to elide or be rejected or assimilated to the following consonant, especially in those situations where that noun would characteristically take a schwa because of the normal pointing of the Hebrew verb form. And so we saw that rejected in the examples we looked at of tain. That's the cal imperative, masculine singular of Nathan, give. Gash, approach, cal imperative, masculine singular from Nagash. Tanu, cal imperative, masculine plural, because the Shariq, we know it's masculine plural. And this is from Nathan. And sa'i, we know because of the Hirik yod, it is a feminine singular. So it's a cal imperative feminine singular from nasa, lift up, lift up. The assimilation takes place, and we just looked at this very briefly, and then we had to leave last time. So we're going to pick up there and take a look at this. Titain. Titain, when you look at it, you're saying that looks like a PL perfect, third masculine singular. But you go to your lexicon and you look up tau, tau, noon, and you don't find anything. So that means that something here is added. And if it's added, that means something has also disappeared, because you want to find the 3-letter root. And so we have to assume that since the noon by itself is very rarely a suffix, that the tau that's at the front must be an imperfect prefix. If the tau at the front is an imperfect prefix and has a Shariq under it, that means that this is either a cal, imperfect, like yik tol, teek tol, teek tali, or it's going to be a nifal imperfect, like yikatel, tikatel, or it's going to be a hithpael imperfect, like yithkatel and teethkatel. But if we make it a hithpael, that means the second tau has to be part of the prefix. And if it's part of the prefix in the hithpael, it always has a schwa under it. Therefore, we rule that out. That means then that we have a cal or a nifal. The nifal triangle is a Shariq under the prefix, a doubling Doggish in the first letter, and a comets under the first letter. This has a tseri. So we rule out the nifal because we do not have an adequate representation of the nifal triangle. So then we attempt to see if this cannot be perhaps the cal imperfect, which is really the only thing left when we've gone through that process of elimination. And so the doubling Doggish in the second tau represents an assimilated letter. And we are going to assume, since that is true in 80+% of the time in Hebrew, that it's a noon, we're going to assume it's a noon, and we're going to assume the root is noon, tau, noon. Assuming that, we go to the lexicon, we look up Nathan, and as we look at Nathan, we find that the lexicon lists it as a legitimate verb, and in the cal and in the imperfect forms, it lists this exact form. So therefore, we have our confirmation. They've properly deduced what this form is. Why the tseri under the tau instead of a holum? That is due to the fact of this assimilation of a consonant has affected the way the verb is pointed. And some verbs prefer various types of nouns in that second position. A-class vowels, E-class vowels, and O-class vowels. And Nathan, in the cal imperfect, prefers E-class vowels, as you'll see in the lexicon when you look at it. So that confirms it. Titain, titain. The first Doggish is a hardening Doggish, beginning the word, beginning the syllable. The second one is a doubling Doggish. It is a cal imperfect, second masculine singular, or third feminine singular from Nathan. Questions? James?
When you said it prefers
The E-class vowel.
class, you said look in the lexicon?
Yes.
How would we know that just by seeing that?
You'll just see it in the forms across the page of the lexicon. In fact, if you have Holiday with you, and you should be carrying it to class with you because we'll use it more and more each day because we're doing more and more translation work, and we need to be prepared to turn there. This is on page 249. You'll see that Nathan occurs in the cal 1,900 times in the Old Testament, in the cal alone. You have the perfect listed as the same as the indexed form there, Nathan, and it's just abbreviated for you, indicating you look out to the left margin. And then it shows you that in pause it's Nathan. Natna is the third feminine singular, which can also be Natana in pause. Natata, two different spellings for the second masculine singular. Natat is for the second feminine singular. Natati for the first common singular. Natati for the pausal form. Not nu in the first common plural. natanu in the posal form, natatem in the second masculine plural, natanu, excuse me, is that tenu? I have my trifocals here trying to look at it. Natanu is the third common plural. Excuse me, the third common plural was the one before. This is the first common plural. And then the suffix netano, and then you go to the imperfects. Imperfects, wa yitain, yiten, wa etena, nitain. We have a Pathak in an odd form in Judges 16:5. Yitanenu, yitenka, titano. So notice that there primarily you have E-class vowels in all the imperfect forms. Notice in the imperatives it follows through because they're formed from the imperfect. Tain, ten, tani, taini, tanu. And then with suffixes. And then the infinitives. And then the infinitive construct. Notice that the infinitive neton is an infinitive construct that is irregular and unusual. Neton is the same. But usually it is tate and latate with a lamed prefix. Lateth in some occasions. And then we have letiten, or tito, titi, titenu. Those are all with the pronominal suffixes. And then the infinitive absolute is naton, sometimes fully written. Then you have the participle, and the participle of suffixes. And you have the cal passive participle. It says there, it looks like a wavy little F backward, or it's an F there. That means see the Hofal. So if you want to see what the cal passive looks like, you have to go to the Hofal. And the Hofal on page 250, traditional Hofal is the cal passive, the imperfect utan, be given, and it says nothing more about any participle. So it has an unusual form there. So it occurs primarily in the cal, and occurs 40 times in the nifal, and occurs at least 3 times in the so-called hofal or cal passive form. Okay? Everyone understand what we're looking at and why we say what we do? Because if you look up natan, immediately you see, if you just quickly gaze through, there's only cal and nifal and hofal. So it rules out anything else that you want to look at. And when you look at the nifal forms on the imperfects, you see that they are very different than what we have in the cal. Because the imperfects is yinatain, yinatin. In the infinitive construct, hinatain. And the absolute, hinaton. So there's no other choice than to make this a cal. Okay, Greg?
So when we're looking to confirm that the form is correct, we won't necessarily find that exact form in the lexicon, but something that would...
You will often find the exact form. Holliday claims to have given us every form, but there are exceptions. He has left some out. On this one, on the imperfect, we don't have the exact form titain. We have yitain, we have etena, we have nitain, and we have titano with a suffix, but we don't have this exact form.
But just looking for something that closely...
Right. You look there and see there everything closely resembles it, follows the same characteristics. Characteristic sere and the hirik under the prefix are your clues. And if you go down and look at the nifal, the only other option, there's nothing even close. So it's process of elimination. And that's one of the things I want you to get used to. In language, especially when you're doing translation work and you're working with a language where you're learning, you're just beginning to learn how things work, the process of elimination is extremely valuable to you. You want to utilize your lexicon. You want to go there and look at it, and you want to rule out those things it cannot be until you find what it can be. And in some cases, you'll be able to confirm that it is. Okay? Nigad, we have the same process to go through. Because we look at nigad and we're saying, okay, this could be a piel. that has an unusual A class in it? Or what in the world could it possibly be? And if we go to the lexicon, on this one, you're going to begin with the noun, gimel, and the Talath. So turn there with me to that form. And you'll find nigad on page 226. 226. And notice we have two things about it already. Number one, we see that it has a hifil. You can flip back to the preceding page, and the preceding word is negev. So there is no other. You go down and you have neged, which is a preposition, meaning in front of. There are no other forms that have noon, gimel, Talath, unless you go all the way down to the bottom of the right-hand column and find nagid with a Hirik Yod infix. So there's a hifil that occurs 320 times. You have a hafal that occurs at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, but it doesn't tell you how many times it occurs, and there's no dagger at the end to say that everything has been listed. So as we look at it, the most likely thing is going to be hifil. We look at nigad, it looks like a nifal, participle, masculine singular because of the comments. So as we look at that, we've got to find out, okay, what makes this then not a nifal, participle, masculine singular if all of our choices are hifil and hafal? So we look at the lexicon and we start going through it. We have the perfect. The perfect in the hifil has the hey, higida, higadta. The imperfects, yagid, yagade, tagade, egida, egid, yagidu, tagidu. The suffixes on them, and we have no suffixes here. The imperative, hagade, haged, hagida, hagidi. The infinitive, hagid, lagid. And we keep going, hagade, the participle magid, magedeth. We found nothing that approximates it, right? Nothing. Go down to the hafal. Hugad, wayugad. Notice that you have a kibbutz associated with every one. We did not find this form. We found nothing close to it. So what do you do then? Where else would you go?
Well, look at the form and see what other indications there are from what we're given.
Okay, let's talk about it. Let's walk this one through. We've got to work it out. All right? We've got ni, God. What are the possibilities? We looked at a noon being elided or assimilated here as though it were ni, God, and that was not found under nagad. What else can we do? Look for a yod. Okay, remember yod can be assimilated? So let's go to yagad. Let's take a look there. Let's find what we can find. Let's look at yod, gimel, and Talath. Yod, gimel, Talath. Let me know if you find it. Anyone find it? If you found it, we're going to be asking you what copy of the lexicon you have. Because page 127 has only one word that begins with a yod, gimel, Talath, and it's a personal name, Yigdalayahu. All right? That's a personal name. It says N period P-E-R-S period. That means it's a noun, personal noun. It's a name. Okay, it's the name of a person. And before that we have a yod, gimel, Bathe, and that was a noun of a location. That's a place name. This is a person name. So there is no yod. And we know that the only verb that assimilates the lamed is lakach. There are no other assimilated letters. So we're back where we began. What do we determine on this? Jan?
Can it be the prefix noon?
If it is the prefix noon, as in nin, ningod, as in yik tol, a cow, imperfect, first common plural. Remember what this was? Nifal, participle, masculine singular. We have a holum here. This has the comments here, but we know that sometimes you have a difference in form. And if this noon were to be assimilated, what would it look like? That's what we'd expect. What do we do with it, gentlemen? But look at the category we're looking at in our grammar workbook, in our grammar textbook, rather, the textbook. Right? Aleph doesn't assimilate. It'll disappear, but it doesn't assimilate. John?
How do we know that the noon isn't a prefix and that the root letters are gimel and daleth, and then are missing hey or missing?
Number one, because we're in the textbook and we're looking under pay noon verbs. All right? Number two, a hey or an aleph disappear. They don't assimilate. All right? Gentlemen, this is where, and it occurs one time in the Hebrew Bible. All right? This is where you have to realize the lexicons don't always list everything. Why don't they list everything? Because they've looked at this form in the Hebrew Bible and they've already determined that it ought not to be, so they have amended the text. And they include in their lexicon the amended text, not the actual text. Now, I didn't write down the verse, chapter and verse and book it's found in. I'll have to go do that. But all of these are directly out of Evan Shoshan and his concordance. And so this form exists in the Hebrew Bible, and you have to realize the lexicons are written by people who freely amend the Hebrew text. If you look and you have absolutely no other option, it may be that they have taken it out and not talked about it at all. All right? That's when you go to a book like Gesenius Couch Cali, and you look up this form in Gesenius Couch Cali in the Hebrew index in the back, and he will discuss it and talk about its formation, and probably have a note there with regard to the fact it's the only extant nifal form of nagad. Okay. Yes?
When you say that they amended, does that mean they chose between textual variants, or they just decided even if there wasn't any, it wasn't in any manuscript?
You have both options, and both will occur. There are times when they will do conjectural emendation without any evidence and just say that it must be this way but have no textual evidence at all to support it, or they will do it on the basis of a variant reading. For example, Waltke and O'Connor sometimes will do that in the area of grammar, where they'll change a reading and they will tell you the grammar point we're talking about is found in the Samaritan Pentateuch as opposed to Masoretic text. Or this is the rendering according to the Septuagint with a Hebrew back translation without any other evidence other than the Septuagint, but we're accepting it, and this is the grammar we're going to describe on the basis of that usage. And so you have to watch for that and be aware of it. But this, you will not go wrong. If you look at this very carefully, you have a noon with a hirik, you have a comments under this letter here, and this is a nifal participle masculine singular. remember that if we're a nifal perfect, this would be a Pathak. All right, continuing this concept of the pay noun or initial noun verb, the first position noun verb. If you look at the next line there, you see higid. That's obviously a hiphil, perfect, third masculine singular. The noun is assimilated to the gimel. Hugad is a hafal. Nagod would be a kal infinitive absolute. And I think that one should have a star by it because I don't think that occurs anywhere. And ninnatzel is a nifal. Notice the nifal triangle. It's a nifal, imperfect, first common plural from natsal. 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 And it actually would have 3 nouns in it if one of them were not assimilated. The noun of the first common plural prefix, the noun of the nifal, and the noun of the root. And so when you see that there, you know that that is from natsal, and it is a initial noun verb, and it's a nifal imperfect, first common plural. Now that takes care of the weak verbs that are initially weak. Now we want to move to verbs that are weak in the second root letter. And I want to just introduce this briefly. It's in chapter 27 of your textbook, starting on page 164, and then we're going to go back to translating on 1 Samuel 16 and learn some more about that text. Middle guttural verbs. In other words, 2 guttural, second root letter. If you use Roman numeral 2 hyphen guttural, or an Ioan, because remember the pattern is built on the verb pa'al. So it's an Ioan guttural, or second guttural, or middle guttural are the different ways you'll find it referred to in the various grammars that are available. And verbs like maher. Maher means he hastened. Bacher means he chose. Ga'al means he redeemed. Lachem means he battled or waged war. Sha'al means he asked. Barak means he blessed. These are all middle guttural verbs. They have a hey, a cheth, an aleph. I didn't give you one with an ayin, but you have pa'al there. Pa'al is a middle guttural verb with an ayin. And we have ba'er, which means he consumed. And you have resh as well. So all of the gutturals are represented in this middle position. And notice we're talking about only those that are gutturals. We're not talking about middle vowel verbs like bo or kum. We're talking about those that have a guttural, aleph, hey, cheth, ayin, or resh. So as we look at them, we find out that the rule is that we must incorporate the peculiarities of the gutturals. What are the peculiarities or the rules regarding gutturals? They reject doubling, prefer A-class vowels, prefer compound schwa. So as we look at that, they reject doubling. Barrick, that's rejected the doubling. P-ale would be a Shariq. But if the middle letter is a guttural rejecting the doubling, then to compensate, the E sound, the I-class vowel, becomes an A sound, the tsere. It's heightened to a tsere. The Shariq goes to a tsere. So Barrick is a PL perfect, third masculine singular. The tsere under the Bathe is because the resh has rejected the doubling Doggish that is characteristic of the PL. Me and ta. Me and ta, we have obviously a second masculine singular perfect. How do we know that? The ta on the end, the suffix on the end, ta. When you see ta, you know it's a perfect and you know it's second masculine singular because it is like the personal pronoun. It's like the personal pronoun. The personal pronoun is a ta. And you take that ta, sometimes it's like that, and sometimes it's with the hey. And that is what is used on the end of the perfect verb. All perfect verbs, whether it's cal, nifal, pl, pual, hifil, hafal, or hifpael, they all have the same ending in the second masculine singular. They all have ta on the end. So if you see a ta, you know, regardless of anything else, you have a second masculine singular on a perfect verb. So all we have to do now is figure out which conjugation of the perfect. So as we look at this, we see no prefix unless the mame is a prefix, but the mame isn't going to be a prefix except where? Participle. And we already know this is a perfect, not a participle, right? So that means the mame, aleph, and nun are probably our root letters. Therefore, that means it's not a hifil or hafal, because the hifil and hafal perfect follow their names. Hifil. This is not himmean ta, all right? There's no he on it. There's no ha on it, so it can't be hifil, it can't be hafal. There's no hith on it, so it can't be hithpael. There's no ni on it, so it can't be nifal, right? So what are we left with? We're left with the cal, we're left with pl and pual. All right, those are our three choices. Let's look at it carefully. If it is a perfect and the words sound like their names, does may and ta sound like cal? No, it doesn't sound like it. So we're going to set that aside. Does it sound like pual? No. It comes closest to pal. The problem is we don't have the E at the beginning. We have the A. But since we know that the A sound is substituted for the E sound to compensate for a rejected doubling Doggish, then that would confirm that this is a what? A PL. A PL perfect second masculine singular from ma'an. And then you'd look it up in the lexicon to confirm, and you'd find that that's correct. All right, let's go to the next word. As we look at this next word, what's the first thing about it that you see, that you recognize immediately? The conjunction wow with a Pathak and a Doggish in the following letter. So what does that tell you? It's a wow consecutive what? Imperfect. Wow consecutive imperfect. It's a wayiktol. All right? So we know this is an imperfect. All right? So being an imperfect, then the letter following the conjunction is what? It's a prefix. The imperfect prefix. Now as we look at this imperfect prefix, we have following it a tau with a schwa. How do we find that in most situations? Mainly in the hithpael. So we're going to assume that it's a hithpael at this point. If we assume it's a hithpael and we move on, we have a pay with a Doggish and a comments. Explain that situation for me. Michael? Why is there a Doggish in the pay?
It's not the nifal triangle.
Correct. It's not the nifal triangle. You're doing the correct reasoning here. You're removing. All right. Process of elimination. Okay. Franz says bagad kafath letter. Go clear back to the first lessons on syllabification. The Shariq under the tau is probably a short vowel. The schwa under the second tau, if it's a hithpael, is silent. When you have a silent schwa under a letter, it is closing. That letter closes the preceding syllable. When you begin the next syllable following a closed syllable, all bagad kafath letters take a hardening Doggish. So it's merely the hardening Doggish at the start of a syllable following a closed syllable. All right? Now, if this is hithpael, there should be a Doggish where? In the second root letter. What appears to be the second root letter? Ioan. What is Ioan? A guttural. What does a guttural do? When it rejects doubling, what sometimes occurs? Heightens the preceding vowel in compensation. So technically, this would have been in a strong verb, what vowel under the pay? Right, Greg. Pathak. Pathak. So now it fits. Hith, pa, ale. The a changed to a because the guttural rejected the doubling doggish, and the vowel is heightened to the longer form of the vowel to compensate. And the a, tsere, under the Ioan fits hith, pa, ale. That means the meme is a root letter, so we'd go then and look at pay, Ioan, meme as root letters, and we'd have it confirmed that this indeed is a hith, pa, ale imperfect, second masculine singular or third feminine singular from pa-am. All right, see how you just walk through it? Look at each one and ask, okay, what has occurred or what's possible? And if we make a mistake somewhere along the way, if we look at this and we say, well, what if the tsere meme is the third masculine plural pronominal suffix? Well, number one, we've seen that with a segol. We've seen it with a comets. We've never seen it with a tsere. So that should lead you to be suspicious that it might be. But even if you thought it might be, when you look up the configuration of a tau, pei, Ioan, you'll not find it. Or if you look up other configurations with pei and Ioan, with maybe a noon, pei and Ioan, or whatever, you end up empty-handed. You end up back here again. Even though you took a wrong turn because you thought that tsere meme might be a pronominal suffix on the end of the word, you'll eventually rule everything else out and you'll come back here to look at it and say, uh-oh, it's not a segol, it's not a comets, it's a tsere, it belongs here, it's part of the hith, pa, ale form. Okay, but again, we need to know the names, the stems. They help out, even sometimes in the imperfect, especially with the hith, pa, ale. John?
Maybe I missed this, but when I look at it in holiday, it has a segol under the Ioan there instead of...
A segol under the Ioan? Yes. Let's look at it and see. All right? He's looking at pei, Ioan, meme. And let's see what he's got here. And let's talk about it. Pei, Ioan, meme. You're looking at a cal, an ifal, and a hithpael. And they give watith pa-em, Daniel 2:1, and it's the only occurrence. Notice the dagger at the end. So there is no other occurrence, and they give this pointing. And I would have to look at it in the text to find out what's going on here. But if it's a segol in this particular form, then that's what Daniel was using. And let's look at it here. And there could be a variant reading, and this one is a variant. And normally it would have a tsere, because that is the usual form in your paradigms. And in my text of Daniel, there is a Masoretic note, but it does have a segol. And let's see. The reference here is this is the only occurrence of this phrase, so that doesn't really help. But it's still an E-class vowel, and it's the only one in the hithpael, and it's close enough. Right. So regardless of what manuscript or text you're looking at, or what commentator might say or anything, you'd know this is still it. Okay? All right. What about the next one? Tivarku. What are the clues? Jan, walk us through it. What's your first thing that you see, that you think of when you look at that last word on the left?
I think it's prefix tau.
A prefix tau, okay.
It makes it imperfect.
Imperfect, makes it imperfect. And the Bathe, Resh, Kaf, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Barak, okay. All right, something else, Jan? Anything else?
It is maybe PL.
All right.
Schwa under the prefix.
Okay, we've got a schwa under the prefix, which we expect in the PL and puau. Anything else? Anyone else? What else can we notice here?
And then, if it's PL, then in the second letter, it should be Doggish.
Okay.
And the comments on the Bathe name, lengthened.
Okay, so it would normally be, in the regular verb form, would be a Pathak under the Bathe, and it's been heightened because the rejected Doggish in the Resh. So there's the clue that the Doggish was there but rejected. All right, then we have one more clue left. What's that? The Shariq at the end tells us what? Tells you it's plural. Tells you it's plural, and the Talath at the beginning says it's second masculine plural. All right, second masculine plural from Barrick. You see, everything follows along. All you have to do is memorize the characteristics of these verbs, the conjugations, and memorize the cal in all of its forms, and you can walk through these. And there's sometimes when it's without compensation. Yin nachem, no compensation for the rejected Doggish in the Heighth. But remember, the Heighth is a strong guttural and is doubled by implication. Ni-ates. The aleph is a weak guttural, but still it remained ni-ates. Bi-artem. The Hirik still remains under the Bathe. And uvi etatu. Here you have the same thing. The Hirik has remained. All right? So whenever we look at these, we're going to have to realize that there are changes, and on that last one we also have an unusual verb form. Prefer compound schwa, hith na eri instead of a simple schwa, rachatsu instead of a simple schwa, and rachatsu instead of a simple schwa. So everything we're looking at there is normal. They're just written with the compound schwa. They prefer A-class vowels. Za'ak instead of za'ok in the cal, infinitive construct, and imperative masculine singular of za'ak. Etz'ak, the same verb, prefers A-class vowels. Cal, imperfect, first common singular. Nicham. Nicham is a nifal, imperfect, first common plural, or a nifal perfect, third masculine singular. Here again, the Pathak was preferred, but also you have the fact that the Heighth, as a strong guttural, implies reduplication, and therefore the doubling Doggish that would be here in some cases is not here. And because it's also a pay noon verb, it's doubly weak. And that's how it can be a cal imperfect first common plural, is that it is a pay noon verb, and the noon is assimilated, but the assimilation doesn't show up because the doubling Doggish is rejected. And that's why Nicham has two possible parsings that are very, very different. That introduces you to the problem that you'll find in many Hebrew verbs, that they're doubly weak. More than one weak root letter. And that produces all kinds of configurations. And that's when you go to the lexicon to find out. And to find out if it lists perhaps even your verse, if it is a question. But the context should tell us whether or not it is a perfect third masculine singular or an imperfect first common plural. We should be able to tell by the flow of context whether it's we or whether it's he. Okay, let's talk about middle vowel verbs. Middle vowel verbs. Bo, kum, seem, bosh, gur, and bean are all middle vowel verbs. How do we translate middle vowel verbs? To. We use the infinitive. The first one is to come, to enter. Kum is to rise, to stand. Seem is to place. Bosh is to be ashamed. Gur is to reside as an alien, to wander as an alien. Bean, to understand. All right? These all are middle vowel verbs. The middle vowel verbs are listed by their cal infinitive construct form. That's what's listed in the lexicon. That's why you translate it with two. All the other verbs like Barrick, yada, all of those verbs are given by the cal perfect third masculine singular. So you translate it he something. All right? But these verbs you translate as an infinitive. That's why they're at the top of every vocab quiz you take. I put there cum, remind you, translate as to, stand. All right? These are middle vowel verbs. They are full letter vowels. Hirik yod, Shariq, and holem wow. That makes them middle vowel verbs. And we'll come back next time and talk about them because I want to go to translation here for the last 6 minutes and work on that a little bit. On verse 8 of 1 Samuel chapter 16, and I believe we have several of you who haven't yet translated. We're going to be catching you here. Chad, I asked you to pray. Now I'm going to ask you to translate. And I want you to read aloud verse 8, please.
Wayikra Yishai El Abinadab Wayi Avirehu.
Okay, Waya Avirehu.
Waya Avirehu. Lifnei Shemuel Wayomer Gambazeh Lo Bacher Yahweh.
All right, and translate.
And Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel and said, even this Yahweh has not chosen.
All right. Let's walk through this a little bit here and talk about it. Wayikra is pretty well straightforward. The reason we have a commas instead of a holem with the second root letter in this cal imperfect, third masculine singular, is because the aleph as a guttural prefers A-class vowels. And so kara normally takes a commas under the resh because of that. So it's a wayik-tol verb. Therefore, we begin it to show sequence as so or then. Jesse called or summoned or invited Abinadab. Abinadab, a proper name. The L, you could say he called to, but it's not as though he were standing shouting at Abinadab. And by context, we know Cora has been used of inviting or summoning. And so the L is just introducing the direct object. Therefore, it does not need to be translated. Then Jesse summoned Abinadab. So, or thus, or you could just say and, because it's such close proximity to the previous one, he made him pass by. We have a hiphil imperfect. Yeah shows you a pathak under the yod, which could be due to the Ioan guttural preferring A-class vowel and corresponding short vowel for the compound schwa under it, but the Shariq under the Bathe is the one that proves it is a hiphil imperfect. The yod has disappeared. Rather than reduce it to a tsere from a Shariq yod, which you would expect in such situations on a wayik-tol hiphil that we've talked about before, to have two tseres in a row would be odd. And the tsere under the resh is the connecting vowel to add the third masculine singular pronominal suffix that's the object. So the Shariq is retained instead of going to the tsere. So this is a hiphil imperfect, third masculine singular, with a third masculine singular pronominal suffix. Lifnei is a preposition lamed attached to a noun masculine plural in construct form, literally faces of. So to the faces of is an idiomatic way of saying in front of or before. Shemuel, proper name, Samuel. And then you have Wayomer, then he said, Cal, imperfect, third masculine singular. Gam could be translated as also, but it is also used in the sense of indeed, and emphatic. Indeed, this one God has not chosen. And the idea is God has not chosen even this one, or indeed he hasn't even chosen this one. You can use indeed, even, or also. Bazeh, ze is the demonstrative pronoun, masculine singular. Ba is the preposition, Bathe. The reason for the comets is not an article because, number one, there's no Doggish in the Zion, and that would be Bazeh. It's just the pointing that is found in this particular situation. And the Bathe preposition is not translated because when Bathe talks about an object of the verb bacher, it merely introduces the object. It is not translated. You don't say choose in. All right? So God, Yahweh, has not chosen this one also, or he has not even chosen this one, or indeed he has not chosen this one.